Harry Potter story from another's perspective, Rowan Barrows and the Heir of Slytherin, Chapter 1, Home Again. Mrs. Ashford started her day at number 22 Mossfield Way alone. There was plenty to be done. There always was. The garden stretched out behind the houses of Mossfield Way in neat rows and winding beds, thick with summer growth that needed tending. She moved between them with practised ease, a tall, wiry woman with hair the colour of autumn leaves tied loosely at the back of her neck. She had once had help. Her son, Rowan, used to work beside her, turning soil, carrying tools, asking far too many questions. But that had been before last year, before he had left for his new school. Now the neighbours' gardens was hers alone. Rowan, it seemed, was always very busy. If he wasn't shut away in his room, he was hunched over parchment at the kitchen table, quill scratching steadily as he worked through yet more homework. Whatever they were teaching at that school of his, it certainly kept him occupied. Hogwarts. Even thinking the name felt strange. A school for witches and wizards, and Rowan somehow belonged there. Mrs. Ashford straightened slowly, pressing a hand to her back as she looked toward the house. One of the upstairs windows was open just slightly. His room. He had changed since he came back, not in any obvious way. He still smiled, still helped when asked, still laughed at the same things. But there were moments, quiet ones, where he seemed elsewhere, thinking, listening almost. And he never quite explained what had happened during his first year, not properly. Rowan had written often enough, of course, letters full of lessons, classmates and stories. He mentioned a boy called Ollie more than anyone else. What Mrs. Ashford didn't know, what she'd never been allowed to know, was just how much trouble Rowan had managed to find. That was thanks, in no small part, to his father. Mr. Barrows had always moved more easily in Rowan's world than she ever could. He'd gone to Hogwarts himself, and now worked at the Ministry of Magic, something to do with retrieval and preservation, though Rowan had never quite managed to get a straight answer out of him. It had been him who made sure certain the letters from Hogwarts never arrived to his mother. It had been him Rowan wrote to at the end of term, a hurried, slightly desperate note asking for help before the school could send anything that might stop him ever going back. Because Rowan had found something, not in a lesson or a book or anywhere he was supposed to be. Hidden deep within the castle, in a place filled with lost and forgotten things, he had uncovered a small chest, and inside it, a glowing orb. He still didn't fully understand what it had been, only that it had spoken, not in a way he could repeat, not clearly, just fragments. Something like a riddle, something that had felt far bigger than him. He had taken it into the Forbidden Forest, and that was where everything went wrong. The memory still came back in flashes, the light, the force of it, the way the air itself seemed to crack as the orb shattered. He had been thrown back across the clearing, the world spinning into darkness. When he woke, it was over, but it hadn't left him unchanged. Rowan was never a particularly remarkable-looking boy. Average height, a sun-warmed face, light brown hair that curled just enough to be difficult in the mornings. But now there was something else. A scar stretched across his chest and shoulders, pale, uneven, and stubborn. Even Madame Pomfrey, the Hogwarts nurse, had been unable to remove it, so he hid it, carefully, constantly. Even in the warmest weather, Rowan never let anyone see more than they had to. He changed quickly, kept a shirt close by, and avoided every opportunity to explain the scars that crossed his skin, especially from his mother. The rest of the year had passed in a blur after that. Lessons, long corridors, near disasters. Of course, most of Hogwarts hadn't been paying attention to any of that. They had been far more interested in perfect Harry Potter. Rowan had spent much of his first year in the shadow of the boy who had defeated the Dark Lord, not once, but twice. It was hard to compete with that, even if he had wanted to. Now, back at number 22 Mossfield Way, none of it felt quite real, except the questions. Those had followed him home. Rowan woke late that morning, the kind of heavy, lingering tiredness that came from staying up far too long the night before. He had lain awake trying to remember the words the orb had spoken, turning them over and over in his mind until they blurred into nothing. It hadn't helped. His room was small but familiar, the slanted ceiling catching the morning light. Sebastian, the old owl, watched him from his perch near the rafters, well out of reach of Candy, who prowled the floor below with quiet determination, tail flicking as he eyed him. Rowan pushed himself up from his bed and stretched, wincing slightly as the movement pulled at his chest, a reminder he tried not to think about too often. He caught sight of himself in the wardrobe mirror as he dressed. He'd grown over the past year, not by much, but enough that his school robes had finished the summer term a little shorter than they had begun it. His face had started to lose some of its childish roundness too, though his light brown hair remained as untidy as ever. Pulling his shirt over his head, he made sure it sat comfortably across the scar before buttoning it almost to the top. Satisfied that nothing showed, he turned towards the door. Crossing the room, he stepped automatically over the loose floorboard that creaked if you put your weight on it. As he passed the wall, his hand brushed absent-mindedly against the strings of his father's refurbished guitar, sending a soft, uneven chord humming through the room. The sound stirred Sebastian, who gave an indignant ruffle of his feathers from his perch beneath the rafters. "Morning, Sebastian," Rowan said with a faint smile. The old tawny owl blinked sleepily at him before letting out a quiet hoot, as though acknowledging the greeting. Sebastian had belonged to Rowan's father long before Rowan was born, faithfully carrying ministry letters across Britain for years before deciding that retirement suited him rather well. Nowadays he divided his time between his father's house and number 22 Mossfield Way, where he seemed perfectly content to spend his days watching over the house from the highest perch he could find. Rowan reached up to scratch the owl gently beneath his beak. "Lazy morning, then." Sebastian closed his eyes contentedly, leaning into the touch for a moment before fluffing his feathers once more. Smiling to himself, Rowan wandered over to the open window. Outside his window, Mossfield Way was already awake. Mrs. Dawlish from across the road was hanging bunting between two fence posts, while Mr. Hughes struggled to manoeuvre a wooden sign onto the village green. Further down the street, a lorry rumbled slowly past, stacked high with folded fencing. Timber poles and brightly coloured canvas rolled tightly into great bundles. Several neighbours stood chatting excitedly outside their front gardens, pointing towards the recreation field beyond the church. Rowan watched them for a moment, only half paying attention. Villagers were always organising something. With a quiet shrug, he turned away from the window and headed downstairs, his thoughts drifting back, as they so often did, to the words that still echoed at the back of his mind. The hallway outside was lined with photographs, some old, some newer. Rowan slowed as one of the older frames caught his eye. It showed his father as a teenager standing outside Hogwarts, with an arm slung around his younger brother Corvin. Both wore Gryffindor robes and were grinning broadly. For a moment, Rowan wondered what had become of Uncle Corvin. His father probably knew. That reminded him. He still needed to write and ask when he was coming to take Rowan to get his things before the start of term. His gaze drifted to the next photograph. One in particular caught his eye. Rowan in his Hogwarts robes, standing beside Ollie, both of them mid-laugh, slightly blurred from movement. Rowan paused for a moment. Ollie Pennington, tall, lanky, dark-haired, and almost always at the centre of whatever trouble was happening. Also, he was Rowan's best friend. But Rowan hadn't told Ollie what had happened in the forest the previous year. Not properly. Ollie had been the one who told him not to go that night, the one who had tried to stop him, and Rowan still didn't know how to explain why he'd gone anyway, or what had happened after. Some things were easier left unsaid. Downstairs, the house was already awake. The smell of tea and something warm drifted through the air as Rowan made his way into the sitting room. His grandmother sat in her usual chair by the window, wrapped in far too many blankets for the middle of summer. Her thin frame seemed to disappear beneath the layers, but her eyes were sharp as ever. "About time," she said, not looking up from her knitting. "I was beginning to think you'd slept through the day entirely." Rowan smirked. "I might have, if Candy hadn't been plotting something." His grandmother sniffed. "That cat's got more sense than most people in this house." She was a small, crooked woman now, age having bent her slightly, but there was nothing weak about her. If anything, she seemed sturdier for it, warm, stubborn, and almost always on Rowan's side. His grandmother had actually been the one to convince Rowan's mother to let him attend Hogwarts. After receiving his letter the previous year, Mrs. Ashford had a very long time to decide whether Rowan was allowed to attend wizard school. His grandmother set her knitting down in her lap and peered at him over the top of her spectacles. "Your mother said to tell you something." Rowan reached for a slice of toast. "What's that?" "She wants you to check the greenhouse before lunch." He paused. "The greenhouse?" "Apparently one of the vents has been sticking again." She gave a dismissive wave of her hand. "Said you'd know what to look for." Rowan smiled faintly. That sounded like Mum. Even after nearly a year at Hogwarts, she still trusted him with the greenhouse more than anyone else. His grandmother picked her knitting back up. "She's been fussing over those plants all week," she muttered. "Keep saying she's waiting for you to tell her what's wrong with them." Rowan laughed quietly. "I'll have a look." "Good." She clicked her knitting needles together. Through the kitchen window he could already see the little greenhouse standing at the end of the garden, its glass catching the late morning sunlight. Heat shimmered softly beneath the panes, and beyond it the vegetable beds looked greener than he remembered. Rowan made his way across the lawn, Candy padding faithfully behind him. Every few steps the cat darted ahead, weaving between Rowan's legs before stopping to glance back, as though making sure he was keeping up. Rowan smiled. He'd always loved the greenhouse. Herbology had easily become his favourite subject at Hogwarts, though Rowan never thought of himself as naturally gifted. As far as he was concerned, he'd simply had years of practice. Long before magic had entered his life, he'd spent countless afternoons helping his mum with her gardening business, watering seedlings, pricking out young plants, and learning, often the hard way, which ones preferred shade and which absolutely refused to be overwatered. Professor Sprout, the herbology professor at Hogwarts, had taught him the magical side of plants. His mother had taught him everything else. From the outside, the greenhouse looked almost exactly as it had before he had left for Hogwarts. Inside, however, it was an entirely different world. Every shelf seemed just a little fuller than Rowan remembered. Alongside his mother's neat rows of tomatoes, herbs and bedding plants now sat an increasingly strange collection of magical species that would have left any of their neighbours thoroughly confused. It hadn't helped that, after discovering Rowan had excelled in herbology, his father had enthusiastically begun ordering packets of magical seeds whenever he could find them. Rowan's mother had been less enthusiastic. One particularly determined climbing vine had already developed what Rowan could only describe as an adventurous personality. Ever since he'd planted it, the vine had repeatedly tried to escape through the greenhouse roof vent, forcing Rowan to gently coax it back inside every few days. "Honestly," his mother had sighed only last week, watching another tendril disappear through the window, "I preferred the weeds." Worse still, the climber had steadily claimed more and more of the greenhouse. Mrs. Ashford's tomatoes, much to her dismay, were slowly losing the battle for space. Every visit now seemed to begin with Rowan untangling enchanted vines from tomato canes, while his grandmother stood nearby muttering that she'd never trusted anything that could climb by itself. When Rowan stepped into the greenhouse, golden morning light spilling through the glass in narrow beams, broken by thick strands of the enchanted ivy that seemed determined to grow absolutely everywhere Rowan didn't want it. The vine twisted lazily across the roof supports before slowly slithering along the glass, moving with an almost snake-like grace. Every now and then a tendril would change direction entirely, as though it had spotted a new route to escape. Rowan had come to the conclusion that he disliked this particular plant very much. It wasn't difficult to keep alive. It was simply impossible to convince to behave. More than once that summer he'd found himself wondering why his father had ever thought it was a sensible gift. Then again, his father lived in the magical world, where enchanted plants were far more common, and more importantly, where accidental overgrowth could usually be solved with a flick of a wand. Rowan, meanwhile, was underage, which meant every inch the ivy gained had to be untangled by hand. It was, he had decided, deeply unfair. Rowan sometimes wished he saw his father more. His parents had separated when he was still very young, so living in two different worlds had always felt normal. He spent most of the year with his mother on Mossfield Way, while his father's work at the Ministry of Magic kept him firmly rooted in the wizarding world. Still, it was hard not to miss him. Whenever Rowan returned from Hogwarts, he found himself wishing his father were around more often, not just because he missed him, but because he was one of the few people Rowan could talk to about magic without having to explain everything first. Mossfield Way would always be home. He loved the greenhouse, the quiet village, and the life he had grown up in. But after a year at Hogwarts, the magical world had become a part of him too, and sometimes the ordinary streets of Mossfield felt just a little smaller than they used to. Eventually Rowan got to work, dragging the old wooden stepladder beneath the far end of the greenhouse. It didn't take long to discover that the roof vent was only the beginning. One determined tendril had forced the latch open, but while it had been making its escape, half the plant had quietly claimed the rest of the greenhouse. Thick ropes of ivy twisted around tomato canes, threaded themselves through shelving and looped around hanging baskets, as though they had always belonged there. Fresh shoots had appeared where Rowan was certain there hadn't been any the week before, and more than one pot had vanished completely beneath a blanket of glossy green leaves. He sighed. "You've been busy." The first hour disappeared almost without him noticing. Rowan worked slowly, never simply pulling the ivy free. Every tendril had to be unwound in the opposite direction to the way it had grown, easing it from around bamboo canes, lifting it over pots and gently persuading it away from the plants beneath. Every now and then the vine tightened around his wrist or refused to let go altogether, forcing him to stop and wait until it relaxed of its own accord. It was frustrating work, but oddly satisfying. By mid-morning the greenhouse had begun to look like itself again. Sunlight reached benches that had been hidden for weeks. His mother's tomatoes reappeared one by one, looking rather relieved to have daylight again, while the herbs, freed from their leafy prison, stood upright as though grateful for the space. Rowan wiped the sweat from his forehead with the back of his sleeve. Then he spotted another tendril disappearing beneath a shelf. "Oh, you've got to be kidding." Kneeling down, he discovered the ivy had wrapped itself round the legs of the shelving, climbed through the watering cans, and somehow managed to tie itself in a loose knot around an old coil of garden hose. Rowan couldn't help but laugh. "You know," he muttered as he reached for his secateurs, "Professor Sprout would have loved you." Another hour slipped by. By the time Rowan finally stood back to admire his work, the greenhouse was noticeably cooler. The roof vent was secured once more, the benches were visible again, and the ivy had been coaxed onto a proper trellis along the back wall, where it seemed perfectly content to continue climbing. For now, at least. Before leaving, Rowan made his way to a small terracotta pot tucked safely on the higher shelf. Nestled inside was a young magical plant Professor Sprout had given him as a Christmas present the previous year. When she'd first handed it to him, it had been little more than a fragile cutting with 2 tiny leaves. Now it was about the size of his hand, its deep green foliage glossy in the sunlight, with 3 fresh leaves unfurling from the centre since he had come home for the summer. Rowan smiled to himself. "You're doing well." He gently turned the pot a quarter of a turn before checking the soil with the tip of his finger. Satisfied it was still damp enough, he brushed a speck of compost from one of the leaves and returned it carefully to its place. Only then did he step back, taking in the greenhouse as a whole. Rowan could have happily stayed in the greenhouse all day. Perhaps it was because working with plants quietened his mind. For a little while, at least, He didn't have to think about the strange words the orb had spoken the year before, or the questions that still refused to leave him. Or perhaps it was simply an excellent excuse to avoid the mountain of summer homework waiting for him upstairs. Every professor seemed determined to ensure their students didn't forget everything over the holidays. Professor McGonagall had assigned pages of transfiguration theory, while Professor Flitwick had left them with a list of charms to memorize, along with the rather stern reminder that they were not to practice any of them outside school. Professor Sprout had set an essay on magical plant pests, a task Rowan had already finished within the first week of the holidays. He hadn't even minded it. In fact, he'd found himself adding extra notes simply because the subject interested him. Potions, however, was another matter entirely. Professor Snape had somehow managed to assign nearly twice as much work as any of the other teachers combined. Rowan couldn't decide whether the man genuinely believed first years had nothing better to do over the summer, or whether he simply enjoyed making them miserable. Either way, Rowan still had 2 essays left to write. He sighed. It seemed far more sensible to wrestle with an enchanted ivy than spend another afternoon trying to memorize the properties of powdered bicorn horn. Rowan was pulled from his thoughts by his mother's voice calling from the kitchen window. "Dinner's ready!" He blinked, as though waking from a dream, and looked around the greenhouse. The afternoon had slipped by without him noticing. With a small sigh of satisfaction, he packed away his secateurs and gardening gloves before gathering the empty pots into a neat stack. At the sound of the clinking tools, Candy stirred from a well-earned nap beneath one of the benches. After spending most of the afternoon enthusiastically chasing the ivy's wandering tendrils around the greenhouse, the cat stretched lazily, yawned, and padded after Rowan as he headed back towards the house. Rowan sat down for dinner with his mother, his grandmother Eleanor, and Candy, who had already taken up his usual position beneath the table in the hope that something might accidentally find its way to the floor. Eleanor, meanwhile, was trying her very hardest to resist the temptation to wave her wand and summon the bowl of roast potatoes across the table. "You know perfectly well you can reach them," Mrs. Ashford said, watching her mother-in-law with an amused smile. "I know," Eleanor replied, "but it would be ever so much easier." Dinner followed much as it had every evening that summer. His mother would ask, a little awkwardly, how Rowan's schoolwork was coming along, despite knowing that most of it made very little sense to her. She never understood half of what he told her, but she always asked anyway. "I've started an essay on the uses of wormwood in potion making," Rowan said between mouthfuls. Mrs. Ashford nodded thoughtfully as though she understood completely. "Oh, that's nice." "It isn't," Rowan admitted. "It's 12 inches long." Eleanor looked up from buttering another piece of bread. "Wormwood?" she said confidently. "That's the one they used to feed sick dragons." Rowan frowned. "I'm fairly sure it isn't." "It is," Eleanor insisted. "Your grandfather told me." "I did Grandad ever meet a dragon?" Rowan questioned. "Well, perhaps not personally." Rowan smiled to himself. His grandmother had a remarkable talent for offering advice with absolute confidence, regardless of whether it was true. He had learned long ago to quietly check anything she told him before repeating it in class. It was usually safer that way. As the meal went on, Rowan found his thoughts drifting once more. Without meaning to, he was back in the Forbidden Forest. The orb, the blinding light, the strange voices, the prophecy. He turned the words over again, searching for something, anything he might have missed. What did it mean? Who could he tell? Should he tell anyone at all? The questions circled endlessly through his mind. Around him, his mother and grandmother continued talking, their conversation fading into little more than a distant murmur. Rowan heard the occasional laugh, the clatter of cutlery against plates, and Candy brushing against someone's chair, but none of it truly reached him. He stared absently at the food on his plate, so lost in thought that the world around him seemed to slip quietly out of focus. "Rowan?" He didn't answer. "Rowan, are you listening to me?" He blinked, the kitchen suddenly snapping back into focus. His mother was looking at him from across the table, arms folded. I've been talking to you." "Sorry," Rowan said, looking down at his plate. "I'm just tired." Mrs. Ashford studied him for a moment. "You've hardly touched your dinner for weeks now." "I'm fine." The lie came more quickly than he intended. She didn't look convinced. "Well," she said, deciding not to push it, "now that I've actually got your attention, the fair's coming. It's Mossfield's turn to host it this year." Rowan frowned. "The fair?" "The Mossfield Summer Fair," his grandmother said, as though it were the most obvious thing in the world. "Every 4 years," Mrs. Ashford nodded. "We'll have our usual stall selling hanging baskets and bedding plants. I was hoping you'd give me a hand." Realization slowly spread across Rowan's face. "Oh, the fair!" "Yes," his mother laughed. "The fair." Rowan shifted awkwardly in his chair. "I don't know, Mum. I've still got loads of schoolwork to finish. I think it'll do you good to leave that bedroom of yours for a while. But I really am busy." "No," she said gently but firmly. "You'll be helping." "That's not fair." Mrs. Ashford let out a slow sigh. "No, Rowan Barrows, what isn't fair is that you've been home for weeks and I've barely seen you." The room fell quiet. "You disappear into your room first thing in the morning. You spend hours in that greenhouse. And when you're here," she gestured towards him softly, "you're somewhere else entirely." Rowan looked down at his plate. "The neighbours keep asking after you," she continued. "Mrs. Perkins was only saying yesterday that she hasn't seen you since you came home." His grandmother nodded in agreement. "And you've hardly been eating." Mrs. Ashford's voice softened. "I know you've got homework. I know Hogwarts is important to you." She reached across the table and rested a hand over his. "But so are we." Rowan swallowed. He wasn't sure how to finish the sentence. His mother gave his hand a reassuring squeeze. "A couple of days helping at the fair won't hurt your studies," she smiled. "And a little sunshine might do you some good." Rowan hesitated before finally giving a small nod. "All right." His grandmother smiled triumphantly. "I told you he'd come." Later that evening, Rowan paused at his bedroom window. Beyond the rooftops, colourful wagons had begun gathering on the recreation field. Lanterns flickered as workmen hammered together wooden stalls. Somewhere in the distance, someone laughed. The fair was arriving. Rowan closed the curtains, gave it barely a second thought, and reached for his potions essay.